welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming out on a Thursday evening in Melbourne when it looks rather winter-like, or at least Melburnians are wearing their winter coats already. I'm Jackie True, and it's my pleasure to moderate this roundtable tonight on feminist foreign policy versus militarisation. So is everybody here for this topic? Okay, fantastic. Before we get started, I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of the land on which the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Victoria is located, and that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So it's my pleasure, as I said, to moderate this roundtable tonight with some really brilliant speakers based in Melbourne currently, or temporarily visiting Melbourne, but really from all around the world. And I'd like to start by just giving you a bit of a sense of the diversity of our speakers tonight by introducing them and telling you a little bit about their backgrounds. So let me start. I'm going to go alphabetically rather than the row. So let me start with my colleague, Dr. Fakonda Akbari. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at Monash University, and her research focus is on inclusive peace, diplomatic actors, feminist foreign policy, and the women, peace and security agenda. Faru has recently published her research on the Taliban's gender apartheid regime in Afghanistan, and also on patriarchal bargaining and peacemaking in that country. She completed her PhD from the Australian National University and the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. And Faru has worked at the UN Department of Political Affairs, the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, and the Afghan Independent Directorate of Local Governance. So it's great to have you on the panel tonight, Faru. And Eid Mubarak, belatedly. Next, I would like to introduce Hanna Manulenko, who is a doctoral candidate in the School of Social and Political Sciences and the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. Hanna's research interests concern feminist mobilisation in Ukraine and feminist perspectives on security, peace building, reconstruction and recovery, which is so important. Hanna is actually a co-founder of Ukrainska Feministyczna Mreża za Swobodu I Demokrację. That was my very poor Ukrainian, but I think it's important to mention. In other words, Hanna is very involved in supporting feminist civil society in her country. It's great to have you with us, Hanna, and she has just come from the United States, so probably very jet-lagged tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce Alice Ridge. It's wonderful to have you with us, Alice. She is the Senior Research Policy and Advocacy Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency, which is a feminist organisation in Australia, resourcing women's rights organisations in Asia and Pacific and contributing to global feminist movements through research and advocacy. And I think it's really important to note that IWDA is the only feminist NGO in Australia focuses in particular on women's agency and empowerment. And IWDA has done a fantastic job over recent years in convening something called the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, which includes a number of the members of the panel and possibly some of you in the audience as well. Great to have you with us, Alice. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Patricia Salas-Sanchez, who is the General Manager of Operations at the Australian Institute for International Affairs here in Victoria. And Patricia is an international relations scholar. Her research focuses on the intersection of social and political theory, foreign policy, digital diplomacy, and feminist politics. She completed her PhD at Monash University a couple of years ago, and she has a forthcoming book on moral foreign policy where she compares Sweden and Russia's foreign policy, including toward Ukraine. It was a very timely doctoral thesis, and I encourage you to read the book when it comes out. Anyway, thank you for helping organise us, Patricia. We are really indebted to you for this evening's roundtable. Next, I'd like to introduce Victoria Shea, the other inspiration for the roundtable tonight. Victoria is a doctoral researcher at Monash University, and she's researching anti-militarism and the far right in Germany. Her research interests include gender equality and backlash against feminist politics in Europe and Germany, and also the development of feminist foreign policy. So Victoria has also had a significant roles in civil society in Europe. She was the co-president of the German section of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is a women's peace organization heralding back to before World War I. And she advocates throughout her research and advocacy for feminist peace, security, and foreign policy. Amazing that you've organized this roundtable with Patricia. Thanks so much, Victoria. And finally, our visitor to Melbourne. It's so fantastic to have Dr. Simone Wysotsky with us. Simone is a senior researcher and project leader of the Department of International Security at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. We call it PRIF in English. Since 2016, Simone has served as the co-chair of the expert group on arms export of the Joint Conference Church and Development. And since 2018, she has been co-chair of the German Association for Peace and Conflict Studies. And Simone's latest research project, and also together with Victoria, is about the backlash against and resistance to feminist peace building around the world. So what a fantastic group, and how exciting to all be in conversation with one another tonight, and to have a fabulous audience here, and I think possibly online. And I would say I personally recruited some Colombians. And I have no idea what time it might be for them, but they were very keen to hear everybody's views on the panel tonight, because Colombia has now also declared a feminist foreign policy, although it's yet to be published. So let's come to the discussion now. And if I might just say a few words to set up the discussion amongst our panelists this evening. So some of you may be aware that various states around the world have begun to declare feminist, explicitly feminist foreign policies. And some, like Australia, also have gender strategies for their foreign policy. So gender equality and women's empowerment have become a tangible expression of some states' identities and their values. And it's now an explicit part of foreign policy regarding international alliances and relationships. And so tonight, we obviously have a number of people, experts in a number of countries that have made these declarations of feminist foreign policy, but also states like Australia that have also strong commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment. So last year at the General Assembly of the United Nations, there was the first convening of what's called the Feminist Foreign Policy Plus group. And that's a group of 20 countries who have joined together to advocate for a gender equality and peace agenda through a feminist foreign policy framework. Now, as yet, this group of 20 countries have not developed a common platform. And there is a lot of variation among them, as I'm sure the panelists tonight will discuss, but it's a really interesting space. And we can actually imagine that the conversations here tonight will actually shape what that common platform, if it emerges, will be. So at the same time, we have this development, and many of us would regard it as a positive development. We also have rising conflict situations around the world, and calls for a war economy and expanded military conscription to prepare for protracted and further wars. And this is occurring in many countries. Some of you may have heard in January a number of large countries, powerful countries, seeking to up their compulsory military conscription. So this leads us to question the relationship between this emerging feminist foreign policy and defence policy, including the current military build-up promoted in those very states that have adopted the explicitly feminist foreign policies. So it's an opportunity for us to tonight, both the panelists and the audience, to ask the question of how a feminist foreign policy should be conducted vis-a-vis the growing conflict situations around the world, such as in Ukraine with Russia's war, Afghanistan with the mass withdrawal of Western powers, Myanmar, multiple conflicts and very protracted ones, Israel, Palestine, extremely protracted and devastating wars. So what does a feminist foreign policy look like for Ukraine, for Afghanistan, for Palestine, for Germany, and so on. Now, I wanted to also just say a few things about history. For over a century, feminists, whether they be advocates and increasingly scholars and policymakers, have been seeking state support to advance core principles of equal and lasting peace. So the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which was adopted by states in a resolution of the Security Council in October 2000, now nearly 25 years old, is just a recent example of feminist advocacy for peace. And I think what's really important here is that feminists have actually disagreed for over a century about the core principles and practices of feminism as applied to foreign policy and peace. So we have a diversity of principles and we have disagreements and not necessarily a unitary position. So I recently read a blog just before we came tonight where some colleague referred to feminist foreign policy as girl bossification, which was an interesting term. But even if we go back to World War I, we can see very contentious debates among feminists. For example, in the UK, Europe, and USA, very much a global north phenomenon, suffragists who were protesting for women's political rights, the right to vote, were united in the cause of a women's emancipation, but they were divided in their moral view of war. So Mrs. Pankhurst said if women couldn't fight, they couldn't vote. They shouldn't be able to vote. And other suffragists argued that women should not only be equal in order to kill. So it's been always a contentious debate, feminism and militarism and militarization. So tonight, I think I just want to set the scene for some questions for the panel. We have to think about what feminist principles are relevant to foreign defense policy and military goals, and how can a feminist foreign policy, which has been instigated by states themselves, and it's often an appendage to the main foreign policy, how can such a feminist foreign policy influence defense and also influence the often unintended consequences for civilians of militarization? So as feminist foreign policy analysts, what guidance can we give to governments? And finally, what is the feminist peace stance during a time of heightened militaristic sentiments and the many failures of wars, occupations, and interventions? So that's a lot of questions. I have more questions than answers, so I'm really interested in your views. So let me just start by maybe asking Vicky and asking each of you a very simple empirical question that you could answer based on your expertise and the country or conflict or context which you're most concerned with or engaged with. So Vicky, what does feminist foreign policy look like in Germany? And to what extent has that feminist foreign policy engaged in military and national defense debates, including debates about increasing militarization?
Yeah, thank you, Jackie, for the question. Thank you for all of you to be here. It's really exciting for me because we have so many different perspectives. My perspective I will be speaking about is from a German civil society perspective, because while the feminist foreign policy in Germany was drafted, I was in a civil society organization in Wilf, Germany, and we were advocating for a feminist content, but we didn't only advocate for feminist foreign policy in these 2 years before it was published, which was last year in March, but it has a long history of advocating for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, for actually implementing a national action plan in Germany. So it's not as it just came up out of like the German state announced the feminist foreign policy, but there's a long history of work around that. So my perspective as a civil society activist in that time was very critical, because we have advocated for so many years that anti-militarism has to be part of the feminist agenda, or has to be part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And it was so hard work when we reviewed the National Action Plan for the Women, Peace and Security and got in really specific language that militarism is also a cause of war and conflict. And militarized masculinities are also a problem. So connecting the consequences, but also the reasons for war and conflict with gender was always, as WILPF, as an anti-militarist group, one of our main causes. But then when feminist foreign policy was announced, which came to a big surprise to us and that moment, at the same time, there was a big policy change in Germany happening. So around the same time, a few months later, Germany got the national security strategy announced, which is a really long program about how the German defense and security sector will develop over the next 10 years. And the feminist foreign policy that was announced 3 months before was barely mentioned. So we see that there's a very contradictive approach, what Jackie already mentioned, that at the same time there's a feminist push in Germany and also an increase in security language and defense budget. So in the year before, Germany had put up its special fund of 100 billion euro that is only for its military and in security, which comes together to 158 billion euro it's a 52 million billion budget for annually, and then on top of that for 4 years we have another 100 billion euro available for security and defense and our military. So we can see that there's a contradiction, and we not only notice that in language, but we only notice that in this year, for example, this money has to come from somewhere. So the resources were shifted away from humanitarian aid, were shifted away from development aid, which was 8% from all the development spending and 18% in humanitarian aid. So we can see that at the same time, everything that we're pushing for is there in language and there in commitment, but the actions actually are very depressing. So we've been struggling with that, and feminist foreign policy is only, and I think I want to stress that it's a part of the overall German foreign policy, and we have a feminist development policy too. But we as activists always hope that Germany would get a feminist approach to its entire foreign policy. We would think power critical, we would think of the effects of war, we would think of all the women involved. But what the outcome was, it's a very particular policy of looking at the impacts of war on women and looking at the violence from minorities. And I think that's just a little part of what I can say are the first connection that we really struggle with. And I think it's hard in the feminist context to see, like, how do we deal with both of the developments.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thanks, Vicky. And I mean, I think the timing of the adoption of a feminist foreign policy in Germany, especially with the Russian war in Ukraine, and the change in Germany's foreign and defense policy is very critical here. So appreciate that context. Maybe go to Patricia now, and really up to you, Patricia, which country or situation you want to speak about, and possibly you might like to say something about Mexico. Absolutely. Because I think that's a very fascinating case in terms of the extent to which the Mexican feminist foreign policy has engaged with the military and defense, which is also obviously quite significant in that country.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Yes, I'll talk about Mexico, but I'll start with Sweden a little bit, just because my book is coming on that, and that's what I wrote my thesis on. And actually, that's not the only reasoning behind it. So, as all of us who study feminist foreign policy, I started my research looking at the Swedish case, because in 2014, after Margot Wallström became the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, she was the first person and foreign minister to implement and adopt a feminist foreign policy. And this was revolutionary because it has never happened before. It was the first feminist government, self-declared feminist government, to explicitly say that they were going to be adopting a feminist foreign policy. And that was in 2014, which means that if Sweden hadn't abandoned its feminist foreign policy in 2022, 2 years ago, and it's partly triggered by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Sweden's feminist foreign policy would have turned 10 years this year. So it's crazy to think that 10 years have passed since Sweden proclaimed its feminist foreign policy in 2014. And after that, we know that other countries, including Canada, Luxembourg, France, and even my home country, which is Mexico, including also Spain, Libya, Chile, Germany, have followed Sweden's steps and have also adopted a feminist foreign policy. The essence of adding the word and adopting a feminist approach to foreign policy has been involving a fundamental rethinking of the power dynamics and a commitment to negotiate and challenge power hierarchies, gender institutions, but also gender practices. So it involves a lot more than just adding the F word, as we see in a lot of scholarship and articles everywhere. So in the specific case of Sweden, when this first came out, they were saying that this was a commitment to gender equality and the full enjoyment of human rights by all women and girls. This means that it was not just inside national borders, but it was going to include women and girls and all humans pretty much in the entire world. However, as has been introduced by Jackie, we have been seeing the existence of feminist foreign policy at the same time as military spending has been increasing and militarization as well. So in the case of Sweden, which is quite interesting because it was setting the lead for the future countries to follow what a feminist foreign policy would look like, Sweden was also engaging in these militaristic practices. For instance, despite adopting a feminist foreign policy, Sweden was contributing to exporting arms to other countries. As we have seen also through research, they were also exporting arms to Russia even before the invasion of Ukraine. Then Sweden increased its defense budget in 2015. It then reactivated military conscription in 2018 to increase personnel and ensure military readiness just in case something was going to happen. And then in 2016, the Swedish military returned to an island, which is the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea for the first time since the end of the Cold War. And they have also participated in various multinational military exercises prior to applying to join NATO, which happened in 2022, 1 year after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. So, and then this kept happening in 2021, for example. They actually increased Sweden's defense budget, which now represents around 40% increase from previous years. So it's very similar to the case of Germany, I would say. And here we see how we're seeing so much interest in feminist foreign policies around the world, and Sweden is sending this example. But what does this actually mean if they're actually also investing in militarization and militaristic practices as the ones that I just mentioned? So it just shows the difference between the rhetoric and the actual practice. And that was the main interest of my research, of seeing if there's actually a difference between them or if they're consistent. And it's very interesting to see that feminist foreign policies are also investing in the practice of militarization. And as we know, militarization is a patriarchal practice and it's a cyclical practice. So that's something that really interested me and something that I've been loving researching. And it also something that has been coming in a lot of scholarship has been that it mirrors colonial and imperial tendencies of superiority. So the incongruence is also similar in other countries, including, for example, Mexico, where we have the militarization to fight the war on drugs, which has been happening since I was a teenager living there. And as we can see, that hasn't really solved anything yet. So it's something to ponder about. And also the state has been being militarized a lot lately in Mexico. So there's definitely an incongruence between the practice of having a feminist foreign policy and also investing and practicing militarization. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks so much, Patricia. And I think it's it's great that you mentioned the Swedish case and the decade since the feminist foreign policy was first declared, but also how easy it is also to rescind a feminist foreign policy has been done with the change in government in Sweden. But the Mexican case is also fascinating, really high militarization. And of course, we have a feminist foreign policy in that country, which is definitely for the outside, less so than for within the country. I'm tempted to keep going in the line, but I'm also kind of keen to change the perspective a bit and maybe go to Hannah and just to get your thoughts on what does a feminist foreign policy mean for Ukraine, and to what extent is it consistent with a feminist engagement with defense and military?
Test. Thank you, Jackie, for the question. Thank you for organizing this panel, Vicky and Jackie, and other people involved. I'm very much privileged to be here, and my gratitude extends to the many people in Ukraine men, women, non-binary people who currently resist the full-scale invasion in the battleground, and to many more people who are engaged in civil society work, volunteering, and shaping gender-responsive policymaking in Ukraine at this moment. They do this work in a very difficult context, in the context of critical lack of military support, in the context of structural violence of donors, who often lack sensitivity towards what it takes to operate in the context of full-scale war. And they do this work in the context of in a quite challenging political environment of a country in having martial law in place. At the current moment, Ukraine does not have a formalized feminist foreign policy in place. However, Ukraine is currently implementing its second national action plan, Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan, which it actually updated less than a year into the full-scale war. Similar to Germany, adoption of WPS in Ukraine has been a result of joint action of civil society and a response from feminist-minded bureaucrats in the government. As of today, different regions of Ukraine have developed regional and local action plans. So there is a national action plan, one at the state level, regional action plans at the level of the sub-state regions, and local action plans at the level of groups of cities or villages, just in case. So this has already happened, and this has been a practice including for the regions that are partially or fully occupied by the Russian armed forces. On top of that, Ukraine has ratified the Istanbul Convention. It happened in summer 2022, and for a context, this is the convention that criminalizes gender-based violence. In 2018, Ukraine lifted a legal ban on women occupying combat positions in the military, in such a way recognizing the work that they have already been doing without being formally admitted. Subsequent legislative changes also address the conditions of women in the military service. Ukrainian civil society has been organized in various forms, in forms of network, such as the one I'm part of, in forms of annual feminist forums where a discussion takes place on how to affect a gender-responsive policymaking, how to engage in recovery process of Ukraine. Since February 2022, a state-led platform for gender mainstreaming and inclusion in recovery has been established to ensure coordinated cooperation among ministries, other central executive bodies, civil society, business representatives, and international organizations, as well as to incorporate the principles of gender equality and inclusion into the process of Ukraine's recovery. Most of the milestones I've mentioned, which is like part of the list, has been strongly informed by the work of the civil society, women-led organizations, and feminist movement, often in cooperation with the Government Commissioner for Gender Policy and her office, which was established in 2017. No, Ukraine does not have feminist foreign policy. However, while Russia utilizes anti-feminist agenda, claiming to protect the so-called family values as one of the reasons, as a justification to invade Ukraine, feminists in Ukraine do what they can to actually do the opposite. and they see their work, we see our work as one of the axes of resistance and as a way to preserve the gains of our feminist work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. I can imagine for many Ukrainian women to live in a country that was occupied by Russia would mean to threaten your very basic rights as a human being and as a citizen. So I understand that fight is very important to a feminist vision for peace. Can I go to Peru? And really interested in your thoughts on feminist foreign policy and what it might mean for Afghanistan, and to what extent you think a feminist foreign policy could be at all relevant in the context of a complete evacuation and withdrawal from that country.
Thank you, Jackie, for the question, and also want to extend my thanks to Vicky, Patricia, and colleagues at AIIA for organizing tonight, and you all giving us your precious evening to be here. I think I'm at the very odd end of the spectrum when it comes to feminist foreign policy or foreign policy at all. There is no foreign policy for Afghanistan. We have a government, a terrorist organization that came in, took over Afghanistan as a result of foreign policies of countries that had codified gender equality in their foreign policies. And the result is what is happening for Afghanistan today. There is a lot of feminism happening inside Afghanistan, a lot of women resisting, things that my colleague mentioned, Hannah from Ukraine, similar, but maybe different approaches. Considering the restrictions on women and feminists, and it's to the basics, the fundamentals, to protect who they are as women, because today they are reduced to subhumans in Afghanistan. And I think what a timely topic, considering so much is happening, the rise of extremism, far-right extremism or Islamic extremism or Buddhist extremism across the world, and how all of this is impacting women. We need to really talk about what is feminism and what is militarization, the cohesion of both, the separation of both, the impacts of both. I think Afghanistan is a very live case to look at what has been happening there. It is a very conservative Islamic society in these far parts of the world, considering where we are in Australia, an underdeveloped country, but it has a very rich history. It had a peak of its time when it comes to gender equality. Afghanistan was one of the first countries that accepted or practiced gender equality rights, such as the right to vote. But where we are today, right now, Afghanistan is the only country that girls beyond the age of 12 cannot go to school. Women cannot walk outside their home. Women have to, even a woman doctor have to have a mahram or a man to accompany them. They cannot travel anywhere. And women are banned from all kinds of employment. And mind you, this all happened because of a foreign policy option that the US adopted, which codifies gender equality. And on 8th of March, Antony Blinken, the State Secretary, said that gender equality is the core of US foreign policy. But when it comes to Afghanistan, they spend so much blood and treasure, my money, my treasure, my people, my blood, but also theirs. The 3,000 people that died in September 11, twice as that of American and foreign forces died in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban. But at the end, after 20 years, they handed the country back to the Taliban. And what does it resulted to? What we are seeing today. And nobody recognizes it. Nobody wants to talk about it because it's just this faraway country there and not relevant. But the security threats that is emerging from Afghanistan and the kind of regime that is in power and restricting women's fundamental rights is also affecting the physical security that what international politics define for themselves in the region and beyond. Al-Zawahiri, the Al-Qaeda leader, where was he killed? In Afghanistan. just after evacuation and then under the watch of the Taliban? Are we just going to wait and see another 9/11 style happening? There's 21 terrorist organizations right now operating inside Afghanistan. So the parallel is that authoritarian regimes that are so abusive towards women, they're also the ones that threaten security. And the problem that I see as this girl from a village from Afghanistan, that feminism is so far away, like this third generation of rights is far away. For me, it's all about being alive as a girl and going to school. And I see that why my rights are not part of the security of the world. Because it could impact everybody at one day, just like it did on 9/11. And this is where I think we need to really tear up and just bring in these policies of feminism, gender equality, and militarization. Yes, militarization in Afghanistan in 20 years brought so much opportunity for many people, many women in the country, because there was a space created under democracy and women, right, that women could have a place to fight, have a place to fight with their families, that I want to go to school, let me go, because I have the right recognized in the Constitution. But now that is taken away from them. And I think in the 21st century, and I'm sitting in front of you in Melbourne City, I don't know if I have to be ashamed that today I'm talking to you about the basic fundamental right of my cousins who are 12-year-old and they can't go to school and they're suicidal. Some of them have already attempted. And there are a rise of young girls' suicide across Afghanistan, because it's been 3 years. It might feel short, but 3 years we have all experienced COVID. What is it like to be contained, right? But imagine them. Everything's taken away from them and we are watching. But our countries, because of their foreign policy for security, are still talking to the Taliban, giving them money. There's over $30 million on monthly basis sent to them in cash through the UN to the Taliban to operate their regime, while a regime that is denying the very fundamental rights. And what is the future for a country as that? And are we going to be the passive witness for this? Are we going to forgive ourselves in the future that we have watched a country? We remember racial apartheid in South Africa, the international mobilization against racial apartheid in South Africa. Gender apartheid is happening in Afghanistan. It is not recognized. And we, as Afghans, are fighting many fronts as Afghan women to convince the international partners, the foreign policy people, foreign ministries everywhere in the world, that, hey, the mess that you created in Afghanistan, at least save the women, because they're the ones that are the real victim. And imagine a country, what's going to happen with having the Taliban in power in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faru. And I think for all of us, the case of Afghanistan is critical and sobering, and in particular to sort of observe the failure of militarization to actually drive meaningful change in that country. And I think for the question that we're debating tonight about, feminist foreign policy, and to what extent, what kind of defense policy, what kind of engagement with military, I think there's a real question for us going forward. What would a feminist foreign policy do in relation to a extremist group that is violating the very basic human rights of more than half its population? So I think it's a critical question for feminist foreign policy in any country. Thank you. I think I'll go to Alice next, and really keen to hear from you. And don't expect you, Alice, as overseeing a range of programs in the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, to speak to any particular country or situation, but rather to think about how you see feminist foreign policy in relation to defence and military, and also the increasing militarization we see around the world.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks to all the other panelists as well. I think something that we conducted a piece of research a couple of years ago looking at the pathways different countries had taken to getting feminist foreign policy commitments in place. And something that came out of that sort of secondary to the actual research topic was militarization as kind of the key debate in feminist foreign policy. It was the thing that came up most consistently in terms of a gap between civil society and government on feminist foreign policy, that governments really saw, they didn't see any issue with continuing their defence policy as it was and adopting feminist foreign policy, whereas civil society groups were really saying, you need to think more critically about this. And so I think it is one of the sort of the key debates, and we're in the process of updating that research at the moment and looking, at the time we did it, there were only 4 or 5 FFPs. There's now many more, and there's also some countries that have stepped back, like Sweden, and also Argentina made a commitment to feminist foreign policy right before their last election, then had a really right-wing government come in, and obviously that's completely off the table. But, the Netherlands, there's also been a change of government. They're still in negotiations. It's unclear whether their feminist foreign policy will survive. So there's sort of, I think, a bit of a vibe shift in the feminist foreign policy world at the moment, both because of countries stepping back and sort of this sense that we might have peaked in terms of the number of commitments that we're going to see, but also because of the discrepancy around issues like militarization, where the rhetoric and sort of the principles of feminist foreign policy really don't match up with what's happening in practice. And I think that it's leading to a lot of disillusionment and reconsideration of feminist foreign policy in civil society. And something that I've been thinking about in the last couple of months is actually really reclaiming feminist foreign policy back from governments. I notice that I often, I work in advocacy, I'm often talking to the Australian government about this, and I realised I always say, feminist foreign policy, it's an approach that's been adopted by these countries. And that's not all it is. It's feminist principles come from civil society, they come from feminist movements. Some governments have chosen to integrate them into their foreign policy, at least rhetorically. But that's not what it is. It's not all it is. And so I think there's sort of a real reclaiming happening at the moment in kind of the global thinking on feminist foreign policy. That's really about accountability for the commitments that have been made and really calling out where those gaps are. And just really sort of thinking through what it means, what it should mean in practice. The other thing I wanted to mention is Australia. I do a lot of advocacy, obviously, on Australia. We run the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. Australia doesn't have a feminist foreign policy. It has many commitments to gender in foreign policy going back, it's been a core priority for at least a decade. But I think we see a really similar trend, which is that it has barely touched defence policy. There are commitments to women, peace and security, but they're very much about, they're not getting to that sort of transformational potential. They're much more about including women in defence rather than thinking more critically about defence policy. And a good example of that, I was in Canberra a couple of weeks ago speaking to parliamentarians about the aid budget and really advocating with other organisations in the sector for an increase to the aid budget, which is currently at 0.19% of our gross national income, so less than 20 cents in every $100. And by contrast, defence is 2.4% of gross national income, so it's over 10 times higher. And the message that we got in, consistently was, there's a cost of living crisis. We can't be increasing the aid budget when, people are struggling to pay their bills. And later that week, the government announced that they would send $4 billion to the UK over the next 10 years to the Rolls-Royce company to help them build nuclear reactors that we want to use in our AUKUS submarines. And so the same week they were telling us, we can't increase the aid budget, there's no money. they were finding money for defense. They're finding more money for defense, for militarization, and to go to a private company. It's on top of, we've already sent $3 billion to the US, or committed $3 billion to the US for a similar thing under the AUKUS partnership. So I think it's, the contradiction exists here as well. What Australia has committed to is a First Nations approach to foreign policy, which is really exciting, I think, and a really promising commitment. It's pretty small scale at the moment. The Ambassador for First Nations people, Justin Mohammed, is doing a lot of really great stuff. A lot of it's in Indigenous trade and sort of building up those connections. So I think, it's that's been another big gap, I think, in feminist foreign policy. Many of the countries have not engaged with settler colonialism. And for a country like Australia, I think that's really important. But it will be quite interesting to see, I think, where that commitment goes over time. And I'll just take the opportunity to promote the podcast that we've just released on First Nations foreign policy and looking at feminist and First Nations approaches, which I'd really recommend listening to. It's called F-IT.
Maybe you can spell that out.
Yes, F-IT, not effort, like applying effort. It works better on paper, which I will say I did raise at the time, but it works very well on paper, which is, it's looking at exploring First Nations and feminist approaches to foreign policy, hosted by Julie Balangari, who's a excellent researcher up at Griffith University. And our latest episode was an ambassador with Justin Mohammed, did I say our latest ambassador? Our latest episode is an interview with Ambassador Justin Mohammed.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Alice, and for that pitch. I'm sure we can all go and look on Spotify, and I've listened to the first episode and it's fantastic. So really appreciate that, and the stark contrast you've given in the Australian context to our aid budget and our defence budget. And if we go right back to not a feminist foreign policy, but I would argue one of the first advocates of making gender equality really important was Hillary Clinton when she became Secretary of State in the United States. And her key effort was to put the quadrennial review of defence on a par with state. So you would have also build up the significant development aid budget as a way to prevent conflict and in other situations, rather than just to use defence and military as the first line foreign policy strategy. So thank you so much. Lastly, go to Simone and our visitor, and also coming back to the German case and how feminist foreign policy has or has not engaged with issues of militarization. And of course, Germany is important because we used it to promote tonight's roundtable with the picture of your foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, on the slide.
Yeah. Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful panel. I think we've already heard a lot of very interesting perspectives. And I would like to just add some international perspective of international relations, and also tie this to German feminist foreign policy. So my special expertise is on arms control and disarmament, also on arms export control. And when you look at the German feminist foreign policy, which came out last year, there are 2 times where arms control and arms export control is being mentioned. So on nuclear arms control, there's this goal being defined of a secure world without nuclear weapons. There is also mentioned gender-specific effects of women suffering from nuclear testing, and their compensation should be taken into consideration. So quite interesting aims you can read there. And when it comes to arms export control, this policy should not only focus on conflict-related sexual violence norms, which is enshrined in the Arms Trade Treaty of 2014, but it also says in the German feminist foreign policy that criteria such as the status of women, status of violence against women and girls, and as well as gender-based human rights violations should be taken into considerations when arms export licenses are being granted. So here again, you see an extension in existing norms. And my first thesis would be that we see a lot of norms on paper with this German feminist foreign policy, but the practice looks quite differently. And I come to this, I come back to this in a minute. And when you look at militarization there, you can see in the last 10 years an overall overarching increase in military buildups. So I had a look this morning at CIPRI statistics, and the total global military expenditure increased by 3.7% in 2022 to reach a new high of $2.2 trillion. And the military expenditure in Europe saw its steepest year-on-year increase in the last 30 years, in the year 2022. And the three largest spenders in 2022 were the US, China, and Russia, and they accounted for 56% of the military expenditure worldwide. There are some other very interesting indicators when we look at European security and defense policy. For example, you see new R&D in nuclear developments and a tendency of militarization with some new instruments such as the European Defense Fund, which focuses on R&D in military equipment. Also the European Peace Facility, which is another form of a military build-up or a sort of interventionism to help foreign countries with building up their military arsenals. We also see an increase in national defense budget throughout Europe. And when you take Germany, for example, Germany wants to meet its 2% of GDP, and it has already cut its spending on crisis and conflict prevention, also on development aid as well. Germany has only recently resumed arms export to Saudi Arabia, and we haven't mentioned the Yemen conflict yet, which is another forgotten war, I keep naming it. And Saudi Arabia is one of the key warring fractions there, and relying on German and European and US fighter aircrafts in conducting this war. And until recently, Germany has also exported arms to Israel, and it has stopped actually after the 7th of October, but it finds itself now in a rather uncomfortable and new position, being confronted with the pending court case, Nicaraguan court case at the International Court of Justice. You might have heard about this. So we are, at the moment, we are in the stage of 1 year after the passing of the feminist foreign policy. And we have seen some improvements. For example, when you look at everyday bureaucratic policies, so the government has asked the foreign ministry bureaucrats to really change its routines and acquire knowledge, and also think more about gender equal spending policies. But what we haven't seen is anything at high level politics anymore. So last year, there was a lot of high level political action, but in German politics, you do not hear very often anything about feminist foreign policy. There's a new use of the introduction of a new term called gender transformative. It's really interesting to see that German bureaucrats are being asked to think about the power relations which are being embedded in their respective fields. So for example, in my field, small arms and light weapons control, they're being asked to identify what are the power politics surrounded in this respective field. And this is quite difficult to identify for German bureaucrats. I can tell you, I'm very often in conversation with them, and they ask me, so what do we have to do, and how can we identify these power politics, for example? And I've been involved in political consultancy on small arms and light weapons over the last almost 20 years, because in fact the UNPOA, the instrument trying to get rid of, or actually arms control on small arms and light weapons, was being agreed upon at the same time when the WPS agenda was being decided. And since then, it has been my continuous pleasure to educate or teach every incoming new head of delegation when we have these review conferences or the biennial meeting of states at the UN level on the UNPOA on gender issues. And this hasn't changed anything so far. It's really, really hard because most of the head of the delegations are male, and they think even small arms and light weapons control, which is part of humanitarian arms control, has nothing to do with gender issues. So to end my little talk here, I would say feminist foreign policy is an opportunity. We failed so far to get it to the level of high politics, and it has become somehow stuck at the level of bureaucratic politics. And we are going to see, I think, this year we will have elections at the level of the EU, and we will see, I think, some more conservative parties winning the elections in almost all countries. And we will see a further, what we call gender backlash. We will have, next year, we will have Germany's upcoming election. And I think we will see a change in government, and we will get a more conservative government in Germany. And I think we will experience a similar thing as Sweden did, that we will see an end of feminist foreign policy.
Thank you for that very pessimistic conclusion, and what we would expect from a scholar of security studies. I think we're going to take a moment before we go to questions. I want to ask each panelist, and maybe to be brief, because we are very keen to have the audience question. I'd like to ask each panelist to just reflect on and just be very brief if you can, so we can have the audience questions. Given the pessimism, which I think is the pessimism of the intellect, but perhaps with the optimism of the will, just to paraphrase Gramsci, if you were to normatively, how should feminist foreign policy really engage with national defense and security? And what would be one feminist principle that you would bring to bear on current debates about defense and militarization? So start with, we'll go down the line.
I think the one thing that I think of is feminism is always resisting, and resisting an increased defense spending is one thing, which is really hard to do. But I think there's also the idea of resisting a form of societal change into militarism. That's like the whole ideology of why we think militarized solutions to conflict are a thing, and that always go along with very strong masculine forms of masculinity and violent masculinity. So I feel like feminism to me is always resisting the power structures in place. And I actually was just thinking, Faru, when you said feminists now are resisting to states that have a feminist foreign policy, I'm like, oh my God, feminists are resisting feminism, like state feminism in a way. But I still think that this framework and that what we just talked about gives us the space to talk about it, again, to resist it and to question it. And we need to keep the space. And I think no other big concept gives us the space to have this conversation. So I think in an analytical and in resisting way, it's still a concept that we need to keep and that we need to bring forward and reclaim.
Fantastic.
Oh, sorry,
It's so good. Amazing, Vicky. I couldn't agree more with her. I think having an explicit feminist foreign policy is a radical transformation already, in the sense that you're employing a word that is just a lot more than just feminism. It implies so much more behind that. And we can hear this from millions of activists around the world. And saying that you having a feminist foreign policy that's being resisting militarization and defense, it's already doing something transformative. So we have this orthodox idea that in foreign policy, to find peace, you must prepare for war. So these ideas goes back for centuries, long time. So it keeps reinforcing this logic that military capability is the most effective instrument to achieve national goals, but we're looking through a feminist lens that we want human international goals as opposed to just national goals that will be the best for not only women and girls, but the entire society.
Thank you. Echoing you both, I think, again, I can't take away Afghanistan from my mind and bring that perspective into the themes tonight. A feminist foreign policy have to define that defense is always not about the hardcore military security, but also the security, human security, women's security. In the last 2.5 years, we have been hearing any diplomat, Western diplomat, including states that have adopted feminist foreign policies, saying that Afghanistan is safe and secure. The security is better than it has ever been. But they never define the prevention of women's rights, the restriction of women's rights, not the fundamentals of it, that they can't even walk out of their home or go to school, as a security matter. And that's and that's something that I think any foreign policy that codifies gender equality, or ones that define itself as feminist foreign policy, to bring this perspective into that defense mechanism, that gender equality is also a threat to security. One thing. I also want to take the opportunity and mention that practically, like in the broader policy level, that's most of the time we feel very helpless as citizens. We can't do it's policies, whatever, but there are so many things that policies can do on the ground and influence, be it through their humanitarian work, through third parties or other things. For example, Australia today, they do have a foreign policy towards Afghanistan in terms of supporting humanitarianism and stuff. And what are they doing? We don't even have that communication with our lawmakers and policymakers. Since the withdrawal and even before that, there has not been a single scholarship given to any girl in Afghanistan at the Australian universities. We have so many universities here, and we have humanitarian scholarships. And girls and women in Afghanistan, they cannot go, but they do qualify. There are people who are prepared, they have taken the exams and everything, they're prepared, but they cannot get a visa to travel to Australia and go to university. And how could, and this is something very simple. You don't have to deal with Taliban. You just give a scholarship to a girl in a village in Afghanistan to come and study in Australia. That's something they can do, but they're not doing it. There are other methods, such as helping women-led local NGOs inside Afghanistan through the humanitarian work. It's not always UN or MSF, the bigger organization. There are many local organizations, women-led, and that are working on the ground, that these countries, through their networks, through the diaspora communities, can help and reach out to these communities that are supporting girls' school. I'm a co-founder of one of these NGOs. We have been working in the last 2.5 years. I have rugs that these girls made while they're doing their studies, but also making rugs so that we could pay them, and I could sell the rugs here. If you want to buy one, let me know. And this is just a way that we could operate, unfortunately. And also create spaces for dialogue for us. This is a globalized world. We have many Afghans in exile or diaspora, many women, but in the meetings we differ here and there, even they happen very rarely. I see only men, mostly men, go to this meeting. Create spaces for women from conflicted countries to come together and talk about the peaceful solutions, about peace building, about peacemaking, about advising your foreign policy towards that country or that region. These are not hardcore military defense, real politic things. They are very, very, very realistic, practical, but at the same time implementable steps that our countries can take to address gender equality and take those little steps to help people who are fighting on the ground.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Farouk.
Yeah, is it on? Oh. Okay, now it's on. Yeah, I would like to echo what Farouk has been said, that I think feminist foreign policy needs to have a domestic foreign policy as well. And the same applies to Germany. We need a gender equal and really fair asylum seeker policy, which we don't have. Yeah, and this applies to Afghan former employees who used to work for the German military, for example. They are stuck in Iran or in Pakistan and now being expelled from Pakistan to Afghanistan again. This is just to echo what Farouk has been said. And otherwise, I would say that there's no easy relationship between feminist foreign policy and militarization or national defense policy, because on the one hand, being a feminist, I would also stress that we need demilitarization, global disarmament. We also need gender disaggregated human security policy. And I would also say that we should relate feminist foreign policy to the existing sustainable development goals. This is a missing debate we have. But on the other hand, we have this Russian war. I mean, I'm from Europe. I'm sorry to stress this. We have this Russian war in Ukraine, and there is this right to self-defense and the right to resist, which is also being claimed by Ukrainian feminists. So, and I'm sympathetic with their claim. Who am I, living in a safe and secure space, not to allow them or to grant them that they can claim their right to resist and to self-defense. And this implies also the support of military equipment and arms. And these are not easy things to talk about being a feminist, but I think we have to confront ourselves with the bleak realities of war in Europe, for example, or war otherwise. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, for stressing this. I'll address 2 points. First is that gender backlash is something that's happening internationally, which is something that Simone and Vicky's and other colleagues of theirs report highlights. And so it would be a false assumption to think that gender inequality or gender issues is something that happens like outside the global north or in the conflict-affected areas. In fact, if we think about feminist foreign policy as a unifying platform, this should include, and maybe first and foremost, address the issues within the so-called prosperous and stable environments. Second is, I learned that Ukraine is referred to as a peace dilemma by some feminist security scholars for a reason. There was no easy answer. I wish I could say like stop war. I wish I could say let's disarm big strong states. I'm just not really sure how this should work in practice. But what I know for sure is that the longer it takes to stop Russia, the more likely it is that militarism as an ideology will root in the Ukrainian society, and all the work that we feminists have been doing will be in vain. And so to do that, unfortunately, we rely on international support. We rely on international support precisely because Ukraine is not militarized. We don't have military industry that could support us in resisting without relying on the Western weapon. This is why, for me, it was annexed without any resistance in 2014. Moreover, Ukraine actually handed over its nuclear arsenal to Russia in return for security guarantees as soon as it got its independence. And so, no easy answers, but I think an ongoing discussion that would involve civil society representatives, international NGOs, and state representatives would be something we would have to keep happening.
Thanks. I think picking up on the last few points, the principle that I was thinking about is the principle of not seeing things in terms of binaries, but seeing more complexity and the kind of both and rather than either or. I think that that's really true of an issue like militarization, which is, demilitarization. It's not going to happen overnight, and we can't just go to a government and say, okay, we'll get rid of your army. That's not going to happen tomorrow. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do towards that end. And I think, in a similar way with a case like Ukraine and, situations like Myanmar, which I'm a bit more familiar with, and we've just published a paper through the AFFPC Issues Paper Series, which Jackie and Faru have both written for as well, looking at the conflict in Myanmar and the work that women's rights movements are doing to really set up towards a federal democracy, towards a peace process, towards transitional justice. And, not just kind of looking at the conflict and thinking, well, this is all there is, but really, looking beyond that conflict and towards a peace process that's, it's not the start of the conflict in Myanmar. A lot of people were talking about a return to democracy, but some of the feminist movements have pointed out it wasn't a full democracy. For ethnic minorities, for women, it wasn't representative. And so actually, it's not about a return, it's about transforming the situation. And so, yeah, I think that sort of principle is really important. And I think just the final thing to point to, Jackie, you brought up Colombia right at the start. Sometimes there's a tendency, and I do this as well, in talking about feminist foreign policy, we just talk about the big countries, the powerful countries that have them. Colombia has made pacifism the first principle of its feminist foreign policy. Chile has taken a really strong focus on economic justice. Slovenia has also really been advocating on Gaza as an action of their feminist foreign policy. And so I think, there are these examples of states which are taking a really different approach. And I think it's really important to point to as well that, we can't just let feminist foreign policy be defined by the Europeans and the Canadians, but that it is an emerging and contested space, and there are different approaches, just as there are different feminisms. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Such great points. Thank you all. So many paradoxes. Feminist foreign policy supporting just wars in order to oppose militarization and highly militarized occupiers like Russia. But also I think really important points about, the really different contexts, and that feminist foreign policy must mean different things for different contexts and for different states. And interestingly, I just have to make this remark about Colombia. I think it's very promising because it has been a feminist foreign policy developed from below, from out of the peace agreement and out of the significant activism of the women's movement in that peace agreement. And it's called feminist foreign policy. It's going to be called that for the world, but inside Colombia, it's called foreign policy with a gender approach. So it's also about different audiences, different debates inside and outside the country, and also that Colombia, whilst it has a neutral position on Russia's war in Ukraine, because as a member of the G77, it has certain constraints. Nonetheless, Colombia is co-leading with Ukraine the working group on conflict-related sexual violence in the UN. So it's really interesting to see, as a number of you have emphasized, the spaces, the entry points, the opportunities, the platforms provided by feminist foreign policy, even in the context of very challenging and very dire situations that we confront. So I'd like to open the floor to questions for you. Please direct them to any of our panelists, and I might take about 3. So please put your hands up over here. Please introduce yourself too, if you can, just so we know who you are and get the conversation.
Hello.
There we go.
Thank you to the panel and all the organizers. I didn't know what to expect tonight, but thanks for shedding light to a lot of different aspects of it. I just wanted to find out from Simone how, because of a question that Jackie asked, how positive can we be actually when you mentioned the Hague court case, when a woman from Germany, a woman lawyer, I believe, who came from this country where feminist foreign policy had made all these strides, could stand up and say that humanitarian war crimes had not been actually committed in Gaza, and that was their defense. And I just would like to find out from all the panelists what their reaction to Feru's presentation is, because Feru, I totally believe that none of your relatives or your women folk should feel the shame, because the shame, as you said, fairly and squarely seems to belong to a lot of countries that are more prosperous and have had adopted feminist foreign policies, but have forgotten the women of Afghanistan, because of what Patricia seems to have mentioned, that unless you can take the imperialist approaches in militarization, it would be somewhat harder to combat. Thank you.
Fantastic. Are there other questions in the room? And obviously just keep them brief, because we're nearly at our time and we do want to be able to answer them. So here, and someone else over there, that's great.
Thank you, everyone. If we could please keep it to a short, brief question so we can have as many as possible. Thank you so much. Okay, hi. Thank you. I'll try and keep it short. My name is Annette and I work in international development with feminist organizations. And for my question, I kind of want to dream big, because I know it's been quite a bit of down to think about feminist foreign policy and militarization. And I want to ask the panelists, what would it look like for especially Western self-proclaimed feminist foreign policy countries, for their foreign policy to be designed and informed by the people who suffer the consequences of their foreign policy, not just in aid and development, because that's happened a bit with Canada and so on, but in trade, in military policy more widely. But if we're dreaming big, what would that process actually look like?
And over here, I think.
Thank you very much. Christian Derrick from Paris University. Thanks to the panel for a very thought-provoking and emotion-provoking evening. I have a question that is quite specific, actually, and it deals with the Sweden situation. I would be interested to hear from the panel if they think that the adhesion of Sweden to NATO is manifestation of the regression, the abandonment of feminist policies, or if it's compatible with it, with keeping in mind that a strong NATO or other democratic force could have made a big difference in preventing the catastrophe in Afghanistan, for example. So I'd be interested to hear your views.
Are there any other questions? Because maybe it's good to take everyone's questions and then have one round. Please, yeah, thank you.
Just like, yeah, it is. I'd just like to ask what the panel thinks, or somebody thinks, about what the effect the election of Donald Trump, if that happens, will have on feminist foreign policy, particularly in Europe, where he's chastised Europeans and they have increased their expenditure on, as you said, in 2022. Clearly, well, they'd been treated like school children by Trump. What will happen if Trump is elected?
Okay, any other really large questions there? Yeah. Down the back.
Hi, my name's Lily. I was just wondering, and maybe this is more towards Hannah, but just broadly, like, what does feminist foreign policy look like in times of war, especially when there's maybe not necessarily an active government? Yeah.
Great. Anyone else? Fantastic. And who would like to jump in? Simone, there was a question to you.
Okay, I'm gonna start with your question on the ICJ. Actually, I've been reading the statements this morning, and you referred to the statement given by Professor Anne Peters. And in the end, she really recognized the IHL violations. So I think, I mean, I do not have to defend my government, and because I think it's good that Nicaragua came up with this case, because now the government has to defend its humanitarian policy, its arms export policy, and it's interesting to see, because usually we do not have any information about the extent to what extent Germany has been arming Israel and about the defense cooperation. So we see some sort of information. So this is why I think these court cases are really, really useful. But I think in this particular case, Anne Peters really recognized the IHA violations as well. And the other question I just want to briefly touch is Donald Trump. Really, really interesting, because I mean, we've seen other US governments under George W. Bush, for example. And when you think about the global gag rule, for example, you always see a deteriorating in sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this also affects the international level, the level of at the UN, but also when it comes to development aid. And this will cause, I mean, serious problems again. Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you.
Yes, I'll address the last question, which is about how feminist foreign policy should look like in times of war. Well, if we take an idealistic approach, or how it should be approached, feminist foreign policy should be a unifying platform, a space for actions that will unite various countries and take issues happening in different parts of the world as their own. So that would be a very generic response. I really do not know the particular steps or the plan of actions. It strongly depends on the context. In case of Ukraine, a lot of requirements or demands or like asking for help have been posed. So that could be addressed. Yeah, if it makes sense.
I can address the third question with regards to Sweden. I think there's no right or wrong answer. It's a matter of perspective and context. In my perspective, it could be perhaps regression, but at the same time, if we think about it, they dropped the feminist word from their foreign policy when they applied for NATO, which also happened when there was a new government. So this is not just related to Russia. So perhaps they dropped that because the critique, if they kept it, it would be very high of how they're doing that and how can they actually explain why it's happening.
Just to add 2 points, Germany had announced its feminist foreign policy being a NATO member, right? So I feel like it is something that is so context specific, how we negotiate, how feminist principles apply to some states or not, or what they address. So I'm really surprised that it was never an issue. Like, in Germany was never an issue. Can we have a feminist foreign policy while being NATO members? Wilf was advocating for so long to go against NATO, but now NATO has a WPS action plan, so they are themselves co-opting feminist principle. NATO, there's blogs where you read that NATO needs feminist foreign policy, and I feel like this is such a good example of co-optation that we're witnessing by states, and that we have to uphold and resist against these principles. I think that's a pretty tricky one with NATO in the current geopolitical environment. But I also want to stress that what Hannah said in the beginning, that we know, or in the end actually, we know that all the right-wing shifts that happen in the West and the global North are countries that have started the feminist foreign policy, and that's where anti-feminism is so strong, and including in my country. And I feel like if we are always only talking about this in a foreign space, and like feminism moving around in foreign politics, and that's something that goes outwards from our countries, we do not have the possibility to address that, like in the global North, in Europe, anti-feminism is on the rise pretty bad, and we have to try to address it if you want to keep on talking feminist foreign policy, at least in that space. So thank you also for raising this other examples. But when Trump wins, when Germany gets a far government, like it's not going that bad, but like these are threats that we have to look at internally in our countries.
Just two quick points, maybe not directly relevant, but somehow relevant. One, on Sweden. Recently, the Taliban abandoned the Swedish committee from operating inside Afghanistan, and they had to withdraw. It's a humanitarian Swedish committee that was operating for a very long time inside Afghanistan, that went beyond the last 20 years. And from many meetings that I personally also conducted with them, the word gender is not even part of their agenda. It was all about accessibility in areas that are very Taliban controlled. Taliban defined where the aid goes to. And only when there was the burning of Quran in Sweden, and that's how the Taliban stopped them from operating, is that there was 1 year negotiation between them. So here the learning lesson is that gender and women's lack of access to Swedish's humanitarian aid was not an issue for them, but rather other things, such as the Taliban being offended from the burning of Quran. That tells you about how it's done, unfortunately, practically. One point. Secondly, on Trump. I don't know about the future, but what we have learned from Trump being the president and leading the Western sort of world in the eyes of someone like Taliban actors, extremist Islamic actors like Taliban, that a misogynist men that come and rules was sort of well-known democracy. What does it tell you about them? I conducted interviews with Taliban fighters for my fieldwork, and this is something that they told me, that Hillary Clinton did not win the election because she was a woman, and then he said, stupid Trump won the election, but a woman didn't. So even the Talib believed that Hillary was much more smarter than Trump, but just because she was a woman, she did not win the election. And she's like, if that cannot happen in the world's best democracy, why do you talk about women's rights in Afghanistan? And the message you send to them from your countries to extremist, misogynist, patriarchal actors in that part of the world, it emboldened them. Trump was also the president that signed the Doha peace deal with Taliban, meeting all the conditions of the Taliban to exclude all women and all Afghans from that 14 months of negotiation, which led to the international forces withdrawal and the collapse of Afghanistan National Army to the Taliban. That was a consequences, maybe not directly affected in this part of the world, but very much in my part of the world.
Great. Go to Alice.
It's hard to follow through. I'll just pick up on the question about what would FFP look like if it was designed by the people that it's for, that it's directed towards. And I think it's such an important question, because I think that it is one of the big missing pieces in foreign policy in general, but especially in feminist foreign policy that, is claiming to be feminist. It really should be engaging with those voices. But, in line with what Farouz is saying, I think it's something that we see in international development. There's all this discussion about localization, and often that just ends up being consulting with the partner government, which is not the same. It's not representative of all of society. It's not the same as speaking to civil society groups, to women's groups, to feminist groups. And particularly in contexts where women's voices are silenced, you know, whether that's to the extent of what's happening in Afghanistan or even in the Pacific where there's just very few women in government, you know, it's not enough just to speak to governments and do consultation at that level. It has to go deeper. And so I think that, you know, it's such an important part of you know, how we need to see feminist foreign policy going forward.
That's a great point to end on. And I would like to thank all of the speakers. And I think that the questions are really also extremely helpful. Maybe thinking about feminist practice and foreign policy is kind of a key starting point. And I think that some of those practices are varying, right, in different contexts in different countries, but we can learn a lot by understanding the different experiments with feminist foreign policy. And I just would go back to a very fundamental feminist foreign policy practice that was instigated by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, you know, not necessarily calling it feminist, but when she arrived in a country, you know, obviously many governments concerned about the US diplomatic relationship, but also the development aid. She didn't she didn't go directly to the government, to the leader. She said, take me to your women, and take me to your women in the grassroots at the market, and I'm going there first from Air Force One. And that's going to send a message to the entire country about what matters in foreign policy. And I'm going to walk the talk, right? And that's a very powerful practice, and that's the kind of practice that can be extended by many different foreign policy actors and diplomats across various countries, and that can have set and train a range of effects toward transformation of foreign policy. So thanks to our audience and thanks to our panelists. Please join me.